If you've ever watched any of my videos, you'll certainly know the name Peter Molyneux, aka that bald bloke Larry keeps going on about. That one shot of him nodding has always featured in these intros, normally accompanied by some quip about him being a lying little liar. People in the comments have often speculated about how much I must hate this man, telling me to leave him alone, and saying that I must think he's the biggest arsehole in the history of gaming. Which, of course, I don't. That title belongs to Darkside Phil.
Thank you, you fucking worthless humans, for the views.
The fact is, the glabrous goofball of Guildford has been involved with many a great game. There's no doubt about it. But he tends to get a little bit emotional when interviewed. And when that happens, he often ends up talking out of his bum. And when he gets caught out, people tend to think he's a bit of an arsehole. That's kind of his shtick now. So, this episode, we finally take a look at Pete's failed fibs, his heinous half-truths, and his spectacular spuriosities, as I say. But, hello you. I'm Guru Larry, and I welcome you to Fact Hunt. 5 times Peter Molyneux was an arsehole. Ah, Fable. You probably ought to get used to this, as you'll be seeing this game a lot on this episode. Now, the original Fable was a glorious action RPG where your hero would be built based on the things you did in the world. If you were virtuous and went around saving cats or whatever, you'd be a dashing prince. But if you preferred to punt chickens and stab innocent villagers for no reason, you'd be a pig-ugly rogue. It was a game that promised a player the ability to do absolutely anything. And, as such, it provided plenty of opportunities for Molyneux to go to the press and completely screw up big time. It's bad enough that the process of making Fable almost killed Lionhead. The game got delayed so much that when Microsoft finally set a release date, the result was a crunch period that even King Jong-un would have thought a bit unfair to put people under. On top of this, Molyneux made some promises that were not delivered on. Can you believe that? Such as the ability to have children and the inclusion of multiplayer. The second one in particular came as a surprise to the Fable team especially, considering there had been no plans whatsoever for multiplayer, and the result was an absolute pants-on-head screaming panic at Lionhead Towers trying to cash checks that Molyneux's big gob kept on writing. And yet, oddly, people didn't focus on these things as much as they did an acorn. Yes, an acorn. Early on, Molyneux had gone on one of his usual flowery tangents. He said that you could plant an acorn earlier on in the game, and in the end it would grow up to be a happy little tree. But when the game came out, shockingly, there was no acorn to be found. And people went mad. They threatened to batter down the doors at one Ockham court, demanding the whereabouts of this acorn. Old Peter eventually had to go on his own forums and make a big apology for the lack of an acorn in the game, and said that he would try his best to be quiet when it came to talking about features in a game that might not be included. And we all know how well that turned out, don't we, peoples? The acorn itself would end up included in Fable 2 as something as an inside joke. They removed the wrong nut in the game if you ask me. Yeah, I know the acorn is actually a seed. It just sounds funnier. Remember when the Kinect was called Project Natal? Everyone was going on about this wonderful thing that would finally make us all throw away those pesky controllers in the dumpster. Sure, most people were happy with them, but not all. And certainly not Peter Molyneux, who believed these bits of plastic were holding us back from truly getting close to some gaming singularity. Or something. You know, who knows what goes on in his head. At the 2009 E3, Molyneux unveiled Milo and Kate, a game where you interacted with a boy and his dog, going through various little vignettes and making deep moral choices, such as, do you callously murder this poor snail with your foot for no reason? Or do you not? The game got people excited, and certainly got Molyneux excited, but then it never came out. More than that, Microsoft turned around and said that it was just a tech demo, and there were no plans for Milo and Kate to ever be a game. People, as usual, were furious with Molyneux. He'd been telling those porkies a game, pretending that this was going to be a game. The truth, however, was more complex. Molly actually wanted this to be a game and had been working on it for years. But Microsoft didn't share his vision. And the Kinect ultimately wasn't good for much beyond crappy party games and trolling people into shutting their consoles off online anyway. So it couldn't have physically done what Molyneux wanted anyway. But in any case, it's just another black mark for Molly. Although, is this a case of him being an arsehole, or of Microsoft making him look like an arsehole? That's for you to decide. Let me know in the comments. Those of a certain age will surely remember Tamagotchis. Little digital pets that you had to constantly feed and play with throughout the day. People would always get into trouble with them. The same 30-year-old goon who shares crappy Facebook posts about how they didn't have smartphones back in their day was probably getting told off in class for constantly doting on their bloody pixelated mutt. They were a craze. But what has this got to do with Peter Molyneux, I hear you ask? Well, what we have here is a fairly light case of arseholery, but one that resolved itself in cold-blooded murder. Peter Molyneux became a Tamagotchi arsehole. He was enraptured by the little things. He would go on and on about how wonderful Tamagotchis were. He wore one round his neck like a Sonichu medallion and would spend all day tending to its every need. This drew the ire of Bullfrog's head of testing, Andy Robson, a no-nonsense man who had no time for Molyneux's fetish with a kid's toy. He promised Peter that one day, if he ever got the chance, he would end his pet's life. And then, inevitably, Peter left his office with his Tamagotchi on the desk, where Andy Robson could see it. Molyneux returned to find his beloved pet stewing inside a mug of tea. There was no saving it. It was dead. Murdered. Molyneux was heartbroken. He quite literally grieved over the death of his beloved digital animal. Doubtless, while Robson laughed over him, he paid dearly for being such a Tamagotchi arsehole. Something did come out of all this, however. Tamagotchis, and this incident in particular, were the main inspiration between Lionhead's first game, Black and White, a company that also happened to be named after a hamster owned by Molly's business partner, Mark Webley, that literally died hours later, and produced a game where you had to have a dog that ended up dying, inspired by Molly's real-life canines accidentally being shot by a farmer. Poor old Pete. He doesn't really have much luck with pets, as it happens. Sometimes being a bit of a lying arsehole can have its upsides. Peter Molyneux is fond of sharing the story of how he ended up getting into the computer game business, and it is a story that does make him out to be somewhat of a lying arsehole right from the very get-go. And yet, without it, would we have games like Syndicate, Populous, or Dungeon Keeper? Maybe not. Peter had tried to get into the world of games early on, making a piece of software called The Entrepreneur through his own company, Taurus, that literally only ended up being bought by one person, his dear old mum. Ultimately, he resigned himself to never making it in the industry and started setting up Taurus for an alternative existence, selling baked beans. Yes, really. In another world, Molyneux's business would have been based around making people fart. So his destiny was to talk out of his arse regardless. And then, one day, he suddenly got a call from Commodore, who had confused his company Taurus with another company called Taurus, with an O, that made computer software. Commodore wanted Taurus to make a database program for the Amiga, and they would supply them with computers required for the job. Molyneux was on the wings of a dilemma. Does he say that he's out of the gaming world and now he's nothing more than a humbled baked bean merchant? Or does he lie and say that, yeah, sure, they can do the job? Ultimately, old Sneaky Pete chose the latter option. Commodore soon figured out their mistake, but in any case, Molyneux had the Amigas, and they did actually deliver a database program called Acquisition, as promised, before those same Amigas were used to get Bullfrog underway. Without this act of fibbery, there may never have been a bullfrog. So even if lying usually gets Molyneux into trouble, it certainly worked for him this one time. It's just a shame for him that it almost never worked in any other situations since then. Well, there was no other choice to round up this episode, really. Even the other 4 cases of Molyneux's arseholery put together are nothing compared to the disaster that was Godus. This list could have been filled with incidents from the life of Godus alone, and the ultimate calamity that was the first couple of years of Molyneux's new company, 22 Cans, which he formed after departing from Lyinghead, having just delivered Fable the Journey. A terrible Connect game that was, as it happened, also the final result of all the work done on Milo and Kate. 22 Cans' first big project would be Godus, a new take on Molyneux's favoured god game genre, and it would be crowdfunded on Kickstarter. The presence of Peter Molyneux on Kickstarter turned some heads and raised questions, with people wondering why on earth a rich man like Pete would need to use it. Molyneux became quite standoffish over this issue, and his bullish arseholishness here almost derailed the project. But ultimately, it made its money. Meanwhile, 22 Cans' first game, a cookie clicker named Curiosity, saw a whole load of people tapping incessantly through millions of little cubettes in order to see what was inside the big cube at the end. The winner of Curiosity, a man named Brian Henderson, would be rewarded with the title of God of Gods. Isn't that a titan? He would have influence over the events of what happened in Godus, and, more importantly, he would take home a share of the game's profits. A princely sum of 1%. The game did eventually reach early access, plodding around with mixed impressions until, well, nothing. Godus reached a certain point, and then the updates stopped. A point far from completion with no multiplayer or anything, with absolutely none of the promises fulfilled. And certainly not any of the ones made to Brian Henderson, who 22 Cans had stopped contacting. Rumours ultimately spread that Godus was considered a dead project, and the internet went livid. Molly had not only screwed over Godus' backers, but he screwed over a competition winner and everyone who bought the game on early access. A dramatic shitshow of an interview in which John Walker of Rock Paper Shotgun spent hours essentially calling Molyneux an arsehole followed. Shockingly, this particular case of arseholery has never actually been resolved. Molyneux made a deep apology for what had happened in a video posted by 22 Cans, updating everyone on what was going on. The man in the middle, community manager Ramsey Bolton, left days later. The man on the left, Konrad Nazinski, a backer who ended up being hired by the company, was the sole bearer of Godus' fortunes. He oversaw a new early access project called Godus Wars that was also far from unfinished when that too stopped getting updates. And surprise surprise, he also doesn't work for 22 Cans anymore. 22 Cans have never admitted that Godus is dead, and no one who backed it will ever receive anything from it. But it sure as hell smells funny. I mean, seriously though. Peter Molyneux, what an arsehole. And you lot wondered why I constantly make jabs at him for the past 2 years in Fact Hunt episodes. Hello you. Thanks ever so much for watching. Be sure to subscribe to be first to see future Fact Hunt episodes. Click on the bell if you already are to make sure you're notified, and be sure to check out my other episodes. And if you want to be super awesome, check out my Patreon. But thanks again for watching, and I'll be seeing you next time. Ta-ra for now.